how could one delineate between the languages of fact, value, and interpretation? For example, how might one correctly, conceptually mark the boundaries between the languages we use to describe present events versus past events? Or between the languages that describe one's own culture as opposed to an appropriate language for understanding a foreign culture? Putnam, to link what we just saw here earlier, Putnam thinks that some versions of weak and differential relativism, for example, Williams's account of the possibility of scientific, but not other kinds of absolute conception of state of natural or social world, is in the final analysis too relativistic. Williams's scientific absolute, according to Putnam, may not be cognitively relativistic, but it is certainly metaphysically so. So what's the difference here? Let's see what Putnam says, and I think it will help us solve the problem that Virginia Woolf posed in the context of fiction and what fiction does, or how fiction communicates truth. Whether the questions are addressed to the cultures that demarcate everyday language from the technical uses of language in the sciences, or to the languages we use to isolate the past from present cultures, or to the languages we employ to distance the local from the foreign. The problem of relativism for Putnam goes all the way from the metaphysical, for example, beliefs about what things absolutely or ultimately are in themselves, to the rhetorical, for example, the best choice in the uses of words or descriptive metaphors, so that in the final analysis, one does not think that one can linguistically speak about objects of thought, the things or words, in absolute terms, but only in a continuum from one extreme of objectivity, in this case, to another extreme of subjectivity. How concepts and judgments formed along the continuum get standardized and routinized as truths and norms in any society or among communities of experts are thus conventional, though not entirely so. The distinction between the merely conventional and the entirely conventional is thus crucial. In a choice example, Putnam points out the situations when he says, he uses these examples, in fact, he says that when we say this is a star, or when we say this is a constellation, or when we say this is the Big Dipper, the conceptual relativity of the language or the languages is quite clear. But the relativism in the conceptual relativity is not, as some may explicitly or implicitly argue, an absolute one. So when then, this is my question, when then is a non-absolute conceptual or non-metaphysical, what then, what and when is a non-absolute conceptual or non-metaphysical relativism? There are some who think that this problem has just been solved, or either in the works I just studied, or maybe, let's say, in the past few years, which tells you the vagueness, the whole vagueness tells you something. I believe that a careful review of the evidence suggests that what has been attempted and achieved with uneven levels of success, especially in the United States, has been to pragmatically dissolve the questions. And this is very clever, because dissolve here, I mean it like in three ways. It's like a clever abandon or a clever evasion. That's one. Another one is like an overcoming. And there are two forms of this overcoming. And I can debate anybody about this, because if they think I'm reading the history of philosophy in the US in the past 20 years badly. And then there's a quietistic way of doing it. And I think it's American pragmatism that is doing all this. I don't know how much time I have to do this, but I want to let you know it's there. So I'm going to talk a little bit about these kinds of dissolutions of these problems, and then we can go back to it if you want, because I do want to get to what I really think that the post-colonial point of view offers philosophy and probably other disciplines in the conversations about these matters. So what do I mean when I say that pragmatism abandons the problematic we just described? Well, we can see it in an important essay, an essay that I think transformed philosophy in the United States. It was Quine's essay. It was called Two Dogmas of Empiricism. And in that essay, Quine charges modern empiricism. He says that modern empiricism has been conditioned in large part by two dogmas. One is a belief in some fundamental cleavage between truths which are analytic or grounded in meanings independently of matters of fact, and truths, and then on the other hand, truths that are synthetic. So the dogmatism is that there is this fundamental cleavage between analytic and synthetic. Those of you who love to study Emmanuel Kant would exactly know what Quine is after here. These are dogmas, he claimed, because they are based on, quote, ill-founded reductionism, namely the belief that each meaningful statement is equivalent to some logical construct upon terms which refer to immediate experience. The reduction misleads not just in its implicit claim to foundationalism, but also by one of its necessary consequences, notably the blurring of the supposed boundary between speculative metaphysics and natural science. So, if the boundary or the dichotomy between metaphysics and natural science is quote-unquote supposed, it is because Quine anticipates the opportunity to exploit precisely the problems of the ill-advised dichotomy and do so in ways that favors a shift to pragmatism. Hence, though the immediate target of Quine's charge of dogmatism was Kant's synthetic analytic distinctions, the implications go way back to problems in pre-Kantian traditions. Hume's own distinctions between relations of ideas or logical truths and matters of fact, for example. Or Leibniz's similar distinctions between truths of reason and truths of fact. Or Descartes' own definition of a person as a dual combination of thinking substance and physical automata. These are just examples of issues in the history of philosophy and positions in the history of philosophy in the West that has been affected by this pragmatic critique of what on the surface is just a Kantian dogmatism. By insisting that no satisfactory account of body, fact, or matter has ever been produced in a way that shows how they are separate from mind, reason, and idea, that the claims about the laws of, quote, contradictions presumed to regulate the analytic a priori or logical statements are themselves prone to the same dogmaticity as the analytic synthetic distinctions they are meant to prove, and that philosophically and that nothing philosophically indispensable is lost when the distinctions and the supporting apparatuses are abandoned in favor of a robust pragmatic conception of relations between human thought and actions in objective words of objects and values, or finally the insistences of all these three moves allow Quine to revisit traditional sanctuaries of epistemic idealism in order to substitute the holy cows in the sanctuary with pragmatical ones. Descartes and Kant's loss is pragmatism's gain. For though the mind, body, reason, fact, and ideas, matter questions do not entirely disappear, each reappears transformed, in fact transformed beyond recognition, in the pragmatist's backyard. And I mean backyard. In the second case, heroic, you can call this, instead of abandonment, you could call this a heroic practice of pragmatism. It's a robust conceptual relativity deployed to explain away and overcome metaphysical dualism. The history of this pragmatist move, like the first, is rooted in the history of disaffection with Kantianism. In fact, its effectiveness depends on Kant's insight into the idealized nature of form and function of the concept. But pragmatic heroism also promotes the idea of relativity of conceptual schemes, about which, given the analytic training of most of its American proponents, it is easiest to argue for from the writings of people like Frege, Gottlob Frege, but also some of Frege's very good interpreters like Robert Brandon. Frege's, they all seem to piggyback on Frege's distinctions between reasons produced to justify the use of a concept versus naturalistic, physicalistically or non-physicalistically conceived conditions that may or may cause production of the reasons. Frege had lamented the fact that though we correctly speak about, quote, the task of logic as the investigation of the laws of thought, we constantly fall into error when we also depart from this to think that the laws of thought are one and the same with the laws of nature. So two laws converging on the issue of nature. That this and similar errors are common may be attributed to the ease with which one forgets that in laws of thought one is dealing with spaces of reason, spaces of autonomy and freedom, and not of mechanical causality. For Frege then, in the laws of reason, one ought to be concerned only with what he calls laws which, like the principles of morals or the laws of state, prescribe how we are to act, and do not, like the law of nature, define the causal cause, the causal cause of events. In fact, what happens here is that when we say logic, we're then, in this tradition, talking only about normativity and not on pure science. So why, we should ask, why couldn't one radicalize the conceptual normativity to the ontological or to the natural? From the point of view of logical or conceptual pragmatism, this pragmatism of overcoming, these kind of questions about nature is simply moot. And that is why, I think this is where it's important to distinguish Frege from the American pragmatists. This is a pragmatist move, the pragmatist move now. Why is this question moot? Well, it's moot because something like this. This is the way they will read Frege. Frege had little to say about causal modalities because his interests in the question were primarily semantic. So, from an exclusively semantic point of view, there is no particularly compelling reason, and reason, as explained earlier, to seek harmony, logical or otherwise, between the laws of reason and the causal laws of nature. Diversity of conceptions of reason is just something to be welcomed, not abolished. Now, there's in this pragmatist approach to the problem, however, both the Heidegger-like hermeneutic or the Husserlian phenomenological demands for further explanations are just circumvented. They're circumvented through pragmatists' two essentially different but functionally related deniers. And this is my last bit on pragmatism, that They just use sociobiology in different ways, and to also Darwin sometimes. And Dewey did this very well, and Rorty does that as well. But I want to skip some of this so I can talk about what I call the post-colonial vernacular, because the debates within pragmatism itself is very complex, and I'll be happy to talk about that. The conflict between the idealists and the empiricists comes up even after pragmatism, and we see this clearly in a book that just came out. It's called, well, not just came out, but a book about the book just came out a couple of years ago. It's called Mind and World. It's a book by John McDowell, and he works with Robert Brandon at the University of Pittsburgh. And Pittsburgh is really a good place now in terms of what do you do with pragmatism after pragmatism, and they're working to unify. In fact, the last thing I heard, someone there was trying to reduce Hegel's phenomenology to some kind of a logical tractatus where analytic philosophers who can't stand Hegel can actually understand what Hegel is saying. But that's the kind of issues that are up there, and this is what I'm working out of, and I'm sorry that I really can't give you all the thing that's going on here. All right, so in the 21st century, looking forward, phenomenologists, the group of people I'm sympathetic with, they also some of them work within anthropology. They recognize that many serious study of consciousness is also a study of experiences of time. So I like this statement so well that I'm willing to attribute it to phenomenologists, even if they didn't say it so, and I hope that they find enough reasons in their own work to agree with me on that. This is an insight that was, in fact, already obvious in the writings of people like St. Augustine. St. Augustine attributed time to the innermost constituent of the soul, precisely because he believed that temporality marks both the freedom of the soul and the sociality of reason. In Augustine, when I say that I know something about the world, I'm also saying that the reason I stipulate in this idea of know is not only a reason for my affirmation of the experience of the world, it is also a reason of the world. So in one and the same internally and externally dialogic experience, I come to a rational state of being, not just on account of experience in general, but also out of a particular experience of the world, which, because infinitely susceptible to other reasons, exceeds the reasons I have for the world and of the world at any particular time. In Augustine, we may not see this, but because he uses code words for it. He calls it cities, for example, and he'll talk about the two cities, and he wrote a whole book on it, and it just sounds like it's political philosophy. But I think there's more there. Building on these insights, a vernacular theory of the ordinary in reason must remain entirely historical. But methodologically, the theory presupposes a healthy skepticism toward claims to ultimate epistemic foundations, and substantively cultivates abstemiousness in regard to dogmatic metaphysical claims. It is a vernacular theory of rationality which is neither relativistic nor radicalist skeptical. The designation radical here usually referring to corrosive relativism. Ordinarily, conceptual historical pluralism in its ordinary productive forms as vernacular exercises a skeptical relationship not only to all that is dogmatic in metaphysics but also to radical subjectivism. I can illustrate the critical, skeptical position of this theory of the ordinary and the vernacular by way of another comparison in the consequences of pragmatism. Rorty showed in what ways the relation of language to the world may be described as other than semantic. Like Aristotle, Rorty maintained that reason is a part of human nature, and therefore rationality is, in his words, a Darwinian adaptive, quote, pragmatic, biological and historical phenomenon. Avoiding the Platonic position that philosophers ought to become politicians if politics is to become more nearly rational, as the soul must govern the body or reason the appetite so that, quote, man may live the life of reason, the classic Platonic run on the question. Rorty is more like Aristotle in arguing the plausibility of the case that politics precedes philosophy. For Aristotle, reason was an organic part of life, so that though man is a rational animal, this reason was not infused in, quote, man from outside of the biological and political condition of life with others in community. Rorty builds on this insight, this Aristotelian insight, and proceeded to argue that one must abandon the Platonic model, but the reasons for the abandonment is not the claim that there's nothing to learn from the Platonic point of view, but rather because the technical discussions among philosophers of metaphysical problems like truth with a capital T, good with a big G, justice, etc., it has become narcissistic. Pragmatism for Rorty is one way out of this narcissism. To explain or defend these and similar values underlying this particular way that advocates of this take on philosophy, it does not necessarily require that one commit to essentialist or foundationalist grounding of reason or reason, whether we think of reason here as a small r or big R. Nor is metaphysics of grounds essential for promotion of philosophy and the sciences. So I'm saying if Rorty could choose between Plato and Aristotle, I can make my choices between much of the debate going on in the history of Western, European, American philosophy and what I see as is what I conceive as the post-colonial experience. And you could look at it from sort of a postmodern approach as well, to if you want to understand what's going on with this idea of a post-colonial experience, because I think both traditions, they share commitments to certain projects. For example, that clarification of values are important, especially values that are relevant to questions of social suffering. These sufferings often result from factors that are not just poverty but also class divisions and so on. So the question, how does one reconnect to these issues and do so in a way that can, you might say, can have an appeal? I'd like something in the last part of this paper. That's sort of the downstream that I mentioned in the beginning. How history, how does whatever version of rationality we work with, how does it help us promote one picture of history in our own minds, the ways we've defined mind all along, and how do these the institutions, or beginning from seminars and classrooms and universities and other bodies of life we constitute for ourselves, how do they then come back to refashion our own understandings of the inmost parts of our subjectivities when we debate what it means to be rational? So in any case, the historical element is important to me in that, and I can show, I can step away a little bit from the speculations and tell a story about a young boy who was born in probably 1558 in a place called Abyssinia. The reason why I'm not sure about the date is he was probably 12 or 13 when his father sent him to a seminary to study for the priesthood, and that's when that's when we know certainly the date when he went. His name was Walda Hiwa Zarayakob. The place is Ethiopia now, but I think it was definitely was Abyssinian at that time. So he went to, while he was in seminary, he went through what you might call, I think today, a crisis of faith, an existential steerings of freedom of thought vis-a-vis religious or theological dogmatism. As he described his experience, Zarayakob felt that, quote, the flickering light of reason, unquote, in the human soul ought to be bright enough to enlighten the reasons of the heart's desire for God, truth, goodness, and beauty. Relocating himself, therefore, away from the comforts of the seminary to a cave in the wilderness, he composes a series of hatata. Hatata, H-A-T-A-T-A. He called it a method for rightly conducting the reason on the path to God, truth, goodness, and beauty. And in the preface, he wrote, quote, to the person who seeks it, truth is immediately revealed. And then he also goes on to argue that, quote, that anyone who investigates with the pure intelligence set by the Creator and scrutinizes the order and laws of the creation will discover the truth. Of course, these kinds of statements will make us uncomfortable when we say, how is truth immediately revealed, or how does one investigate with pure intelligence? I just leave it at that. It's a good story, as I said. But Jacob's encounters with a freedom to think also reveal roots of his crisis in their institutional context. There are at least 3 of these contexts, each vying with the other in competition for construction or reconstructions of the 17th century East African historical objectivities. The first and perhaps most crucial of these contexts was Zarayakob's experiences of 3 diverse and rival world religions. One element in the conflict was the struggle between Jesuit missionaries sent from Europe to Abyssinia to evangelize Africans and their Ethiopian hosts. Though already practicing an African Christianity in a tradition which goes all the way back to the earliest apostles of Jesus, Abyssinia was also home to the oldest traditions of Judaism, as well as the largest population of an African tribe of Jews in Africa. Then there was Islamism, the spread of which was witnessed in East Africa faster than anywhere else in Africa south of the Sahara. Finally, there was the animist factor. The Oromos, in particular, remained resistant to both the incursions of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam until well into the 19th and early 20th centuries. In the competing systems of beliefs, as well as the different modes of acquisition or acceptance of allegiances, Zarayakob, like most thoughtful believers, must have experienced the peculiar intellectual bewilderments about the conflicting proliferation of faiths, each of which claimed to be the true and exclusive face of one God. Similarly, in the emerging political dynamics of an incipient global commercial capitalism, Diego Chao had anchored in the Congo River in 1482. A few years later, a most cruel kind of Portuguese trade with Africa started because of that trip, the transatlantic slave trade. The king of Congo, the king of Mbanza, who was one of the first notable Africans to convert to Christianity and took the name Alfonso II, he wrote to Lisbon in 1526, lamenting the ravages of the newcomers. In this letter, which he addressed to, quote, his royal brother, the letter in part speaks about slavery, with less than a diplomatic nuance. He says, quote, "You cannot reckon how great the damage is. So great, sir, is the corruption and licentiousness that our country is completely depopulated," unquote. Further west to the continent, there were also the social and cultural movements for transnational transformations of societies and cultures. In 1481, a monarch in what is now Ghana, unsure what to make of the appearance on the part of the Portuguese monarch, a new zeal to convert in addition to trading, also wrote a protest to Lisbon. The letter reads, quote, "I'm not insensible to the high honor which your great master, the chief of Portugal, has this day conferred on me. Your friendship I have long endeavored to merit by the strictness of my dealings with the Portuguese and by constant exertion to procure an immediate lading for their vessels. But never until this day did I observe that such a difference in the appearance of his subjects. They have hitherto been only meanly attired, were easily contented with the commodities they received, and so far from wishing to continue in this country, were never happy until they could complete their trading and return. Now, however, I remark a strange difference. A great number, richly dressed, are anxious to be allowed to build houses and to continue among us." End of quote. In the midst of these historical realities, Jacob's questions appeared to be together a simple one. What is, or where is, the freedom of the African subject? In answer to this question, his choice of philosophical methods speaks volume. Hatata, in Ge'ez, the language of Ethiopia at that time, means searching, asking questions, or dialogue. Beyond an isolated quest for a privatistic experience of the self, Jacob's method takes on new meanings beyond the previously narrowly theological contexts. Hatata henceforth became a cultural and political idea, a hermeneutical suspicion of the social constitutions of freedom in a given conflicted world. Those who wanted to rule the people, Jacob wrote, said, "We are sent by God to proclaim the truth to you," and the people believed them. Those who came after them accepted their father's faith without question. Rather, as proof of their faith, they added to it by including stories of signs and omens. Indeed, they said, God did these things. And so they made God a witness of falsehood and a party to liars. End of quote. In this, the Hatata constituted a form of an intellectual declaration of independence. In one particularly important passage, he asks us, or the reader, is everything that's written in the Holy Scripture true? Although I thought about these things, I understood nothing. So I said to myself, I shall go and consult scholars and thinkers. They will tell me the truth. But afterwards I thought, saying to myself, what will men tell me other than what is in their hearts? Indeed, each one says, my faith is right, and those who believe in another faith believe in falsehood and are the enemies of God. These days, the Frang tell us our faith is right, yours is false. We, on the other hand, tell them, it is not so, your faith is wrong, ours is right. If we also ask the Mohammedans and the Jews, they will claim the same thing. Each group would say its faith is the right one. And who would be the judge for such kind of an argument? End of quote. It is this kind of climate of cultures. Let me start again. In this kind of climate of cultures, what is truth? How do we come to know it? How best to justify and redeem both its private and public validity? When in the 20th century context, Wittgenstein raises the same question, this is how Wittgenstein, phrased it. Is it wrong for me to be guided in my actions by the propositions of physics? Am I to say that I have no good grounds for doing so? Isn't it precisely this that we call a good ground? Suppose that we met a people who did not regard this as a good ground, and who did not regard that as a telling reason. Now, how do we imagine this? Instead of the physicists, they consult an oracle. And for that, we consider them primitive. Is it wrong for them to consult an oracle and be guided by it? If we call this wrong, aren't we using our language game as a base from which to combat theirs? And are we right or wrong to combat it? Of course, there are all sorts of slogans which will be used to support our proceedings. Where two principles really do meet, which cannot be reconciled with one another, then each man declares the other a fool and a heretic. End of quote. Wittgenstein's predicament, I think, does not escape the terms in which Jacob had framed his own context. I said I would combat the other man. Wittgenstein wondered, but wouldn't I give him reasons? He asks. He also answered, certainly, but how far do reasons go? At the end of reasons comes persuasion. Think of what happens when missionaries convert natives, end of quote. Whether he was fighting for a personal space of reason, for freedom of thought or of religion, or in critique of imperial and colonial politics, religious fundamentalism and racial capitalism, Jacob's work shows how some of the 17th century questions has remained the questions of our own century as well. I thank you for coming.